Abby.
Adam, where'd you go? Adam? Here. Thanks. You're oh,
Thank you.
so tonight I'm here from the Watkins Museum. I'm going to be talking about East Lawrence, which is a neighborhood that I know many of you are very familiar with. It's near and dear to all of our hearts, not only just because it's near, it's right over there, but it is the neighborhood of, it has a lot of history. It's got industry, it has railroads, it's got rental houses, it's got 3.2 beer, and all of these things make up the East Lawrence that we know, that we love. But East Lawrence really does, at some times, and in its history and still today, it sometimes suffers from a reputation that it doesn't necessarily deserve. So I'm here to talk about that and to talk about the more fascinating points of its history. So East Lawrence, Pluck and Perseverance in Lawrence's original neighborhood. My name is Abby Karen. I'm here from the Watkins Community Museum of History, where I do the education and public programs. Big nerd Nite fan. I'm excited to be doing this myself for the first time. So let's talk East Lawrence. To talk about East Lawrence, we really have to start off by talking a little bit about Lawrence's history. Raise your hand if you know anything about Lawrence's history. And raise your hand if that has something to do with abolitionists. Yeah? Okay, good. It all started here. This is the first house built in Lawrence. Lawrence was a tough place to live in 1854. It was on a windswept prairie. The trees that we have here in Lawrence were not there. There were some trees along the river, the riverbed, but by and large it was a pretty desolate place. Tough to live here. We all know that Lawrence was originally settled by abolitionist New Englanders, correct? Yeah, abolitionists. Well, to talk about some of those people who settled Lawrence, who were the first people to live in Lawrence and in East Lawrence, I thought I would create a little diagram to help you figure out what kinds of people would come to this prairie, this really fairly desolate prairie, and created for you a scale of volatility. These are some of the people that lived in early Lawrence. On the left, we have Charles Robinson, who's a very even-handed, stately kind of guy. He was the first governor of Kansas, the kind of guy you could really trust. In the center is Jim Lane, slightly unhinged, yet still electable. Jim Lane was one of the first senators of Lawrence, or first senators from the state of Kansas. He, at one point early on in the Civil War, went to Washington, D.C. and took it upon himself and a group of other Kansans to protect President Lincoln from those Confederates. And they slept in the White House, and they were there to protect the president, and nobody asked them to. And then on the right, you've got John Brown, which everyone knows, who will shoot you in your sleep. So when the settlers first came to Lawrence, I'm going to go back. You don't need to see that yet. When they first got to Lawrence, Charles Robinson and the New England Immigrant Aid Society came to this site, which they had already checked out, wanted to settle there and build an abolitionist town. But once they arrived here in 1854, they found that there were squatters on the land. And not just any squatters, they were pro-slavery squatters. Yeah. So, it was slavery. So, in order to settle the rest of the town, they had to adjust their plans a little bit. They didn't get to settle where they wanted to initially, which was the space that we now know as East Lawrence. Eventually things got worked out and East Lawrence became part of the city of Lawrence. But it did take a legal battle, and it wasn't easy for East Lawrence to get beyond that. So even from the very beginning, East Lawrence had a dirty little secret. It had a lot to overcome. Not only was it literally downhill topographically, it's downhill from downtown Lawrence and from Old West Lawrence. It is downstream from downtown and Old West Lawrence, the stately, lovely place that everybody wants to live. But it also suffered from what the New Englanders would call a miasma. which may or may not be a real thing. It might be related to malaria in the bottoms or the swampy sections of town. New Englanders were pretty convinced that miasma would give you, it would make you sick. And so because East Lawrence was close to the river, they said, well, it must be a really unhealthy place to live. Nobody should live there. Basically, they told new people who were moving to East Lawrence, you don't want to live there, it's going to make you sick. We were talking about this yesterday and figured that people who were moving to East Lawrence were told not to live in East Lawrence, like kids who go to KU today tell the freshmen, don't live in Oliver. So, I know, some people really love Oliver, but do you hear they're tearing down the Cullen?
What?
Yeah, it's on in the paper today. They're going to tear down the Cullen and build 2 new dorms. Anyway, totally unrelated. Yeah. So, aside from McCollum, East Lawrence had a lot to overcome, but by the end of 1854, Lawrence really was a growing place. It looks like this. Those are A-frame buildings. They actually worked pretty well for the conditions. There were 50 dwellings, a saw and a lumber mill, which are pictured here. The one in front is the saw and lumber mill. They're right by the river, well located. There was a butcher shop, 2 stores, 4 religious groups. Religion was very important to the settlers, and a population of about 400. There were 40 foreigners who have arrived by boat. 90 from Massachusetts who arrived by container. 59 from New York, well dressed. 38 from Pennsylvania, they were tough. And 172 from Midwestern states, Ohio, Missouri, Illinois. Really, even though I've given them a pretty stereotypical picture of a farmer, really, they were farmers. They came to Lawrence and to East Lawrence to farm. There was cheap or free land. They had no political agenda. They were here for the land. Anyway, to continue, let's talk about what East Lawrence looks like. The buildings that made up the neighborhood in its early days were really the housing stock and the businesses. There was both in this one community. The housing stock were of 2 styles. There were grand homes, big homes that were owned by the city leaders. Today, some of these homes still exist on Rhode Island, and they're lovely houses. This one pictured here was the home of Scheller Eldridge, who built the Free State Hotel. When that got burned down, he built the Eldridge House. When that got burnt down, he built the Eldridge Hotel. Anyway, get a really nice house. But there are also less grand homes, homes that you'll still see today, and homes that you rent or buy in some cases. A lot of the homes that were built were purpose-built for renting. So today we know that East Lawrence is the place you go to rent a crappy house. It's always been the place you go to rent a crappy house. Some people rented homes, other people rented rooms in some of these larger houses, but it has been a residential community from its early days. For anyone who's really interested in architectural styles, here they are. The state of early housing in East Lawrence, most of the buildings were either temporary or made of brick or native stone, which is unusual when building new houses in a new community because usually you've got a lot of wood. That's not the case in Lawrence. There was a lot of stone, hence we got stone houses. This is the house of slightly later period, belongs to Lydia Krebs, if anyone knows her. You could go at her front door. In addition to all of these houses, there were lots and lots of businesses in East Lawrence. There were 47 grocery stores in East Lawrence alone. 47 grocery stores. We freaked out when Dillon's closed. So they really needed those grocery stores. There were industrial buildings, there were social halls, there were churches, there were schools. All needs were met in East Lawrence. It must have been a pretty great place to live. And a really diverse place to live because the elite of the town lived west. So they lived in Old West Lawrence, but the working class were the ones that populated East Lawrence. That's where the people who worked downtown lived. They rented houses, they built houses. That's where they lived. Next, let's take a look at the industry of East Lawrence. In the late 1800s, East Lawrence really tried to become an industrial hub. First, by way of the river. It was ideally situated next to the Kaw River, and city planners hoped to make Lawrence a big stop on the Kaw using steamboats, but as they realized pretty quickly, steamboats don't travel too well on the Kaw. It's just not big enough. So they said, okay, well, steamboats are going out of fashion anyway, let's build a railroad. They built the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad. I had no idea this existed before I started researching East Lawrence. The Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad ran through the neighborhood across the Kaw, and that is a railroad crossing the Kansas River, taken from the late 1800s. The photo by Alexander Gardner, who took photos all across Kansas. Industry became really important to East Lawrence because workers were living in the neighborhood. They could also work in the neighborhood. There was a lot of factoring in the neighborhood. East Lawrence had factories for farm implements, carriages and wagons, soap, furniture, chemicals, barbed wire. If you come to the Watkins Museum, I can show you this barbed wire because Lawrence supplied the West with barbed wire. I had no idea about any of this, but we have this barbed wire in the museum. We've got a whole shelf full of it in storage upstairs. On the right, we've got, I have a picture of the barbed wire factory in the Bowersock Dam. The barbed wire factory, which today we now know as Avon Jakes, and the Bowersock Dam, which is the Bowersock Dam. The Pollard grocery store, or the warehouse, is still standing today. Does anyone live in the Pollard building? I think that's so cool. I love how they're.
Just standing.
I love that they're redoing it and that they've made it into law. But it really was a central part of Lawrence's industry, as well as East Lawrence's industry. Businesses near the river, the railroad, and other industrial types of businesses did spur other less socially acceptable businesses like gambling and prostitution, stuff that you would usually find in the bottoms or near the railroads. The closure of the Lawrence, Leavenworth, and Galveston Railroad, as the railroad closed, because there's no railroad running through East Lawrence today. When the railroad and the barbed wire factory closed, they hurt the prospects for other businesses, and these closures prompted the growth of the gambling and prostitution, which is not good for East Lawrence's reputation. So the city, or the neighborhood, is really becoming associated with failure and with gambling and prostitution, which is not good for a residential neighborhood. So let's talk about those people living in East Lawrence. They were primarily the working class. They lived in East Lawrence because it was convenient. It got even better once the electric trolley and automobile usage expanded. It meant that the walkability of East Lawrence to the downtown area became less important. People were now able to take public transportation farther afield to the university or to other parts of town. But even though they may not have had 47 grocery stores anymore, it was still a pretty nice place to live. There were a couple of major groups of people living in the neighborhood. First of them are the German immigrants. Lawrence's original immigrant community. Germans who were coming to the United States generally came with a plan. They weren't coming blind. They knew that there was a social structure there for them. They came seeking family who had come already. They came knowing that they would probably be able to get a job and that they would have some place to live. So they weren't coming to Lawrence blind at the turn of or in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They weren't coming here blind. In fact, they really created a vibrant social community. This building, the Turnhalle, which is at 9th and Rhode Island, was a social hall. The Turnhalle is a building meant to be a home for the Turnverein, which is basically a gymnastics organization, but it's really more than that. It's more than just gymnastics. It's about social life and enjoying the company of your fellow German immigrants. Anyway, they could settle and they could enjoy life at the Turnhalle. The Turnhalle was recently purchased by the Lawrence Preservation Alliance, which is fantastic. So look for stuff to be happening there. I know that they've got a lot of exciting plans for it. Life as a German or German American in Lawrence was pretty good, actually. Upper left hand, these photos all come from the Watkins Collection. Upper left hand, they're drinking beer, so we all like that. Germans gave parades. They gave great parades. That parade down Mass Street is celebrating some holiday or some event that we don't know what it is, but it looks really fun. And in the center here is a group of women who are performing something, but they were definitely associated with the Turnhalle and the Turnvereins. I really can't tell you a whole lot about them except that they have nice costumes and they're dancers. The German community did eventually fade out. The younger generation tended to assimilate, and 2 world wars and a German POW camp located in Lawrence all created a lot of bad feeling towards German Americans. So really, younger Germans and German Americans did try to assimilate as quickly as they could. So the community really lost a lot of its momentum. The other group that made up a large part of East Lawrence's makeup were Black residents. There was a huge influx of Black residents to Lawrence after Reconstruction, and in 1880, Black residents were 22.5% of the city's total population. That's higher than it's ever been. That's much higher than it is today. Here we've got Abe and Jake, who were the River Kings. Abe and Jake with their 100-pound catfish. Yes, I got to say Abe and Jake again, and we now know that they were actually some real people, real guys that lived here in Lawrence, existed in Lawrence, and not just a bar that nobody goes to anymore. Sorry to anybody who really loves Abe and Jake. A lot of the Black residents who settled in East and North Lawrence, East and North Lawrence, settled here because it was more affordable. The taxes in East Lawrence were lower. They were lower from the beginning, and so it was a more cost-efficient place to live. Churches helped to build strong support networks, including the St. Luke's AME Church, which still exists today and has an active community. And everybody remembers our friend Langston Hughes, who wrote about and is remembered for his contributions to the history, to recording the history of growing up in the United States as a Black man. There was with this large influx of Black residents, locals got frustrated because competition for jobs went up, and it was even published in the newspaper that the East Side, or the Bottoms, where Black residents were moving, is the worst part of town where housing evils existed. So the racism that was existent in Lawrence was really pointed out in the newspaper. And even through the 40s, KU excluded Black students from living in the dorms. Instead, a lot of those students lived with Black families in East and in North Lawrence. It did change, but the Black residents who lived in East Lawrence really did make a great contribution to the neighborhood and to the city. So finally, let's take a look at what East Lawrence looks like today and where it's going in its future. East Lawrence has a really active and passionate neighborhood association. I went to one of their last meetings, and you rarely get to see a group that is so passionate about the place that they live in. They're really, really, truly committed to maintaining the personality and just the life that exists there in their neighborhood. They have block parties. Really cool. There's still a lot of industry in East Lawrence. Allen Press's headquarters is down there. As we said, the Polar building is just one example of reuse and redevelopment of vacant buildings. The Polar lofts are a really cool space, and not only are they cool and the mingling of old plus new, but they've also gotten celebrity endorsements. Polar. Okay. Finally, East Lawrence, thank you. East Lawrence is home to innovative housing. The Delaware Street Commons is a unique place to live. It's a very communal really very communal place to live, and families who select it as their home choose to do so specifically because they like the sense of community that it provides. So there we have East Lawrence. If anybody has any questions, I'd love to take them. Any questions about you? Yeah?
So we're
Becky wants to know if other groups of immigrants were good at gymnastics, or if it was just the Germans. I think it was just. Yeah.
Did you say there was a POW camp in East Lawrence?
There was a POW camp in Lawrence. I don't know exactly where it was, but I do know that we did have one here.
From that, they actually also put them in with the farmers in the family. My World War II history class discussed it, and a lot of them, when they got released when the war was over, they actually wanted to come back and live with the farmers because the Germans treated the other Germans so well. They didn't bring the Japanese here, but they'd bring the Germans because they would be accepted by the large German population. And some of them actually would, when they could go through the proper channels, came back and would like write letters or something, then she got to come back. But they were over down here by the river. Emily Lawrence Floyd is a really good woman to contact. She's a Lawrenceian, but she knows a lot about the POW camps.
Thank you.
Maybe has a question.
I know that if you ride your bike down, I think like New Jersey Street, there are all these terrible ruts on the road, and I heard they were created by the streetcar line. And I wondered if you knew anything about the streetcar.
I can't speak to the streetcar's history directly. I do know that some of the early blocks that were created in Lawrence were created with the plan for drainage to occur naturally. I don't know about the streetcars per se.
The street, I can tell you, the
Yeah.
streetcar turnaround
The streetcar turnaround,
is in our backyard.
which is
At 19th and Mass.
at 19th
Right
and
behind
Mass.
the Dairy Queen, when we pulled it out, we found some metal, we contacted Watkins, they said, that's the streetcar.
Turned around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Awesome.
So, Gary, good question.
One more question? Yeah.
How did Haskell play a part in this? When did East Lawrence and Haskell eventually meet? What was the demarcation? Was there a relationship between the neighborhood and the school?
In my research, I hadn't found much of a connection, mostly because the East Lawrence that was understood in the early part of the city's history kind of ended at 15th Street and didn't go all the way to 23rd. Eventually, I feel like East Lawrence, and today it probably does encompass the campus, Haskell's campus, but in the early part of it, that didn't occur until a little bit later.
What's all the warehouse space being used for today?
Well, like the Polar Lots, I know we've got the Polar Lots, but there's also other businesses that are moving in there. Maybe somebody who's associated with the arts community will be able to talk about gallery space, because I haven't been able to go to any of the final Fridays that are happening over there. I know Adam's been participating, not to put you on the spot or anything, Adam.
Yeah, there's Seco, which is a gallery slash studio space that people can rent out. It's open every final Friday. The Invisible Hands over there now. Also Trouble Design, right below the Invisible Hand. It's a lot of fun stuff going on. There's always like a weird flash gallery that'll pop up, and it's always really interesting and fun. Sometimes there's food.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, Abby. That was awesome. I know so much more about where I live now.